Guten Tag zusammen. Today we're going to be learning about a new grammar concept called irregular verbs and irregular verb conjugation. We've already learned how to conjugate regular verbs in German. So we're going to start with that, and then we're going to move on to what irregular verbs look like in German. So one of the first verbs that we learned how to conjugate as a regular verb was lernen. Lernen means to learn or to study. And we learned that we use the pattern S1010 to conjugate it. So first we take the stem of our verb. So we look at lernen, and we bring down our stem for each of these to start our conjugation. And then we add our ending, E, S, T, T, E, N, T, E, N, in order to conjugate each of these with the pronouns in German. So we end up with ich lerne, du lernst, sie, es, man lernt, wir lernen, ihr lernt, sie and sie lernen. Now, with irregular verbs, it's not all that different. But we do have to remember that the ones that are inside of the shape that I drew here follow those normal rules. And the ones that are outside still follow them, but they have a little change, something different that happens to them. I like to call these verbs, these irregular verbs, meat cleaver verbs, because they follow the shape of a meat cleaver, that big butcher knife. And the things that are inside of the meat cleaver are nice and sturdy. They stay strong. They follow the rules. But the ones that are outside of the meat cleaver, the du and the s forms, get a little butchered. Something funny happens to them. Now, we are still going to use the stem of our verb to conjugate the ich form, the wir form, the ihr form, and the sie form. And we're still going to use our endings, S1010, so E for the ich form, ST for the du form, T for the sie, es form, EN for the wir form, T for the ihr form, and an EN for the sie form. So we already have ich fahre, wir fahren, ihr fahrt, sie fahren. But for the du and the sie, es form, something funny happens to this. Most of the time it's just a vowel change. Some of the time it's something more than just a vowel change. So it's not du fahrst and sie, es fahrt. It's actually, we add umlauts here. So it's du fährst and sie, es fährt. Let's take a look at another verb that's irregular. Nehmen is irregular. And just like with fahren, everything that is inside of the meat cleaver follows the rules. So we can kind of drag down all of our stems for this. And then we can conjugate them all. The ich form is going to be ich nehme. The wir form is going to be wir nehmen. The ihr form is going to be ihr nehmt. And the sie form is going to be sie nehmen. Now, for the du form and the sie, es form, there's not merely a vowel change that happens here. We have more than a vowel change going on. So we will fill in our st and our t endings here. And then if you're practicing your forms of these, the conjugated forms of all of your irregular verbs on Quizlet, you'll be able to know that it's not du nimmst, but it's actually du nimmst. And then sie, es nimmt. So they actually follow a similar pattern. You just have to memorize these patterns. We do have one irregular verb that is a little different from this meat cleaver shape, and I'm going to introduce that to you now. Wissen is our one irregular verb that doesn't follow this meat cleaver pattern on our irregular verbs list in this unit. There are other irregular verbs that will follow this pattern later on, and other types of verbs that will follow this, but for now this is the only verb that will follow this. I call it a hot dog conjugation pattern, because it kind of looks like a hot dog. You see my two arrows on each of the sides? They're telling us that those two forms are the same on each of their sides. So we already know that this side over here, wir, ihr, and zz, that the wir and the z forms typically always end in en. And that is the case here. The different thing on this side is that the ich form and the rzs form aren't going to take any ending, and we just have to memorize what that weird conjugation pattern is for the verb. In this case, wissen, we've seen it before. Wissen means to know. How do we say I don't know in German? We say ich weiß nicht, right? That means I don't know. And so we actually already know this form. It's ich weiß nicht. And if we know that the ich form is ich weiß and the rzs form has the same form, it's going to also be rzs weiß. And then the do form here is going to have that same stem that we have over here on this side, only it's going to end in not an st but a t. Since we already have an st there, or scharfes s, we're only going to end with a t since there's already an s there. And then on the other side, we're just going to be dragging, like we normally would, our stem down. Wir wissen, and then we'll drag our stem down. Ihr wisst, with a t ending, ihr wisst, and then sie wissen. And this is how we conjugate to know in German. Ich weiß, du weißt, sie weiß, wir wissen, ihr wisst, sie wissen. Now we're going to take a look at some of the workbook pages where you would normally be taking notes in class. Up at the top here we have certain irregular verbs follow predictable patterns of spelling changes in their present tense conjugations. These verbs use the regular endings, but have changes to their stem vowels in the do and the rzs forms. So we just saw that, that meat cleaver, that the two that are outside of the meat cleaver are the do and the rzs forms, and that helps us to remember that these are the ones that have changes to their stem vowels, or even just their stems. Most stem-changing verbs follow one of four patterns in the present tense. So one of the patterns is that your stem has an a in it, and it changes to an a umlaut. So one of our examples would be fahren changes to du fährst, fährt. Another vowel change would be an au changes to a umlaut u, which some examples would be like laufen becomes du läufst and läuft. Some verb stems will have a e in it, and that e will change to an I, like with geben becomes du gibst and gibt. And then we have nehmen, which means to take. Du nimmst, nimmt. And this is an example that not only has a vowel change, but also has a consonant change. That H changes to an M. Some will have an E that changes to an I. Like werden, du wirst, wird. Now you notice that that one looks a little bit different, and this one's a little bit tricky, and I like to say that werden is the worst word to conjugate. Werden means to become. It can also be used to express the future tense later on in German. If you take a look at our meat cleaver conjugation chart, everything that's inside of the meat cleaver will follow the rules. So you'll have ich werde, wir werden, ihr werd. Now here you actually have to put a filler E, just like with like finden and zeichnen. Those are verbs which stem ends in an N or a D or a T. You have to put that filler E in here. Ihr werdet, and then sie werden. Now, when I say that it's the worst word to conjugate, it's really not the worst word to conjugate. But if you remember worst word, and we write in here worst and word, but we make sure to write worst word with really tiny little O's, it will help us with figuring out the conjugated form when we change those O's to I's, and we get wirst and wird as the conjugated forms. Now, normally do ends in an ST, and this does, but the stem ends W-E-R-D. There is no D in that do form. And the RZS usually ends in a T, and there's absolutely no T ending in there. So that's how this is really helpful to remember that mnemonic device, worst word, in remembering the conjugation for werden, to become. Let's get back to our notes that we were taking. Another common pattern is for the E in your stem to change to an IE. So, for example, in lesen, that becomes du liest and liest in our irregular forms of the verb. Now moving on to the bottom of the page, there's a list here of a lot of irregular verbs that are used in the chapter. I have their definitions and their do forms below, so you can see how they change, how their stem changes in that irregular form. So we'll kind of just go through these quickly. Bakken means to bake, and it's du bakst. Braten means to fry, and it's du brätst. Fahren means to drive, and it's du fährst. Fallen means to fall, and it's du fällst. Fangen means to catch, and it's du fängst. Lassen means to let, and it's du lässt. Schlafen means to sleep, and that's du schläfst. Tragen means to wear, and that's du trägst. Waschen means to wash, and that's du wäscht. Laufen means to run, and that's du läufst. Brechen is to break, that's du brichst. Essen is to eat, that's du isst. Geben means to give, that's du gibst. Helfen means to help, that's du hilfst. Nehmen means to take, that's du nimmst. Sprechen means to speak, that's du sprichst. Treffen means to meet, that's du triffst. Vergessen means to forget, du vergisst. Werden means to become, du wirst. Werfen means to throw, du wirfst. Empfehlen means to recommend, du empfiehlst. Lesen means to read, that's du liest. Sehen means to see, that's du siehst. And stehlen means to steal, that's du stiehlst. Let's try some examples in some sentences and see how well we do with filling in the correctly conjugated irregular forms of the verbs. So up in the word bank above, we have essen to eat, fangen to catch, nehmen to take, fahren to drive, ride, or travel, laufen to run, and treffen to meet. So in the first picture, we have a picture of Manfred, and it looks like he's catching a fish. So if we want to fill in that blank with the correctly conjugated form, we determine what our subject is. That's Manfred. So that's like the pronoun he, she, it. Manfred's a guy, so normally that would be like er. So we're looking at our er form conjugation of the verb that means to catch. And we get Manfred fängt. So it takes umlauts in that irregular form. Looking at number 2, we have Sabine, Anja, Thea, und Anna. And then a verb, mittags zusammen. So we take a look at what they're doing. It looks like we see utensils and food on the table. So they must be eating. Our subject is Sabine, Anja, Thea, und Anna. So that's like saying they, which is sie in German. Make sure we're looking at the correct form to conjugate it. Let's figure out what goes in the blank. And essen is the correctly conjugated form. This one doesn't have a stem change because it's inside of that meat cleaver when we go to conjugate it. Looking at number 3, Dana blank den Bus zur Schule. So we would use our correctly conjugated form of nehmen with our subject Dana, and we would get Dana nimmt den Bus zur Schule. Looking at number 4, we have Erik and Florian. And then we have Professor Aiden. So we have to figure out what fits best in the blank there and conjugate it correctly with Erik und Florian, they. Treffen, they meet Professor Aiden, treffen. So there's no vowel change there because that one is also located inside of the meat cleaver. Number 5, Elisabeth, and then we have im Sommer Wasserski. So we have to figure out what fits there. And we get fährt. Elisabeth fährt im Sommer Wasserski. And then Nummer 6, we have Stefan. Nachmittags 8 Kilometer. So we have to figure out what fits in the blank with Stefan. That's our RZS form conjugation. And we get läuft. Stefan läuft nachmittags 8 Kilometer. He runs in the afternoons 8 kilometers. So this was a quick introduction to irregular verbs. Hopefully you guys will continue to study them and practice them on Quizlet so that you will become very familiar with them and just start to know them by heart without having to look them up. You'll continue to see these as we continue with German, and knowing them well and practicing them now will really help you in the future.